Hi everyone, it's Lauren and it's time for another episode of Page to Screen. Today we're going to be talking about all the different TV and film adaptations of Jane Eyre. Now there are a lot of versions of Jane Eyre. I personally found 9 different adaptations and I think there was definitely a 10th in the list that I found which I didn't actually get a chance to find and watch. There may be other adaptations, but to be fair, I feel like 9 is pretty comprehensive, like we're going through a lot of them, so I don't think we really need any more. But because of that, we're going to have 2 parts, because I just think talking about 9 adaptations all in one video is going to be too much for all of us, and I want to be able to talk about each of them properly. So we're going to start with the oldest original adaptations in this episode, and then all of the modern ones from kind of the 90s onwards is going to be in the next episode, which will hopefully be coming in the next couple of days. But just before I get started, obviously I'm going to be talking about the plot of Jane Eyre. There are going to be spoilers for Jane Eyre throughout this video. So first we go all the way back to 1934 with Virginia Bruce and Colin Clive as Jane Eyre and Mr. Rochester. Really, my feelings about this film are that it is old and the quality isn't fantastic. Neither the film nor the audio is really very good, and it's just a very, very basic production. It's only an hour long, so it takes a lot of liberties with the story and with the script. And a lot of the scenes are reduced to the fewest amount of sentences it takes to get the plot across to the audience, and that's kind of it. It just kind of rushes through the story, and everything happens in about the last 10 minutes and then it's all fine. It's very dated in terms of entertainment for people who want to go to the cinema and have entertainment, not people who want to go to cinema to see Jane Eyre, really. It's just a film of that time. Our next adaptation in 1943 is miles better, and it stars Joan Fontaine and Orson Welles. It is a film noir, and it just works really well in terms of the drama on the scene, the black and white of the landscape, the uses of the smoke and the mist, and it's really, really well done, very well written and very well directed, and the performances are fantastic. One of the things I really liked in this film is that the same care and attention is taken with Jane's childhood as it is with Jane when she's an adult. It's really still very well written and very well acted and well directed. Young Jane is really, really good for a child actor, and her friend Helen Burns is actually played by Elizabeth Taylor. Like, when I watched it I was like, oh, this is adorable. But both of them are really good actors and it just works very, very well. And it gives a really nice background to Jane's character because her childhood self is very, very passionate and wild, and she's angry with the world, and Jane Fontaine is very, very contained when she's playing Jane when she's older. But she has this wonderful skill of showing that she is passionate underneath it all. She's not meek and she's not just going to roll over, but she's taken the decision to be calm and controlled. I think it works very well against Orson Welles' Rochester, who is just brilliant. I mean, he's just really sarcastic and surly and sardonic, and he's very, very funny. It's a very of its time performance, but it's just really good. I mean, obviously he's a really good actor, so you know, his delivery of the lines is just fantastic, but between them it works really well. He's very gruff, and the drama and the passion that we have between them is just excellent. And Adele is very good in this film. If you might have seen Meet Me in St. Louis, she's the little girl who plays Tootie in that film, and she's really adorable and really funny. But I think this is of that time when obviously Shirley Temple was very big and people expected children to be cute and funny and provide some comic relief in their films, and so she's actually quite a large part of the film, which is nice because a lot of later adaptations kind of don't really care about Adele because she's kind of annoying. She's just someone who's in the plot, so she has to be there. But this Adele is like the star of the show. Something else I really like about this film is that it's obviously condensed because it's a film, so you can't have the whole book on there. But they've really taken care to make sure that it still makes sense. So for example, after the wedding, when Bertha is discovered and Jane runs away, in the book, she's gone to see her Aunt Reed as she's dying a kind of few months earlier, and then when she runs away, she runs just into the country randomly and meets St. John and Mary and Diana, who she finds out later are her cousins. Like, obviously, just by chance, she finds her cousins somewhere in the UK, and then she comes back after that. But in this film, when she runs away, she runs to the only place that she knows, the only place that she's ever been before, which is Gateshead, which is where her Aunt Reed lives, and she runs back there, and that's when we have the scene with Aunt Reed dying. But it makes sense. It makes a lot more sense that she would go back to somewhere where she knew she had friends and knew she had relatives, and even though she didn't like her aunt and her cousins, rather than providentially stumbling across cousins she never knew she had somewhere in Yorkshire or something. So it does make a lot more sense. And although it's condensed for the sake of time, it's still it's very in keeping with the story. Something which I found really interesting in this film is that you never see Bertha's face, which I feel really in keeps with the kind of film noir style that this is filmed in, and because she's much more of a monster and you don't really get to sympathise with her. When Rochester leaves the church and he takes everyone upstairs and says, come on, let's go and look at my wife, everybody, the camera is positioned behind Bertha, so you see the back of her head, and then her arms reach out to try and strangle Orson Welles, and you just see his face going, ah, and then he pushes her back. And then that's it, that's all we get from her. We never actually see her face, which completely dehumanises her in a really interesting way, and not in a way that I really feel comfortable with, having read the book. It really makes you lose empathy with her as a character, because she's just this crazy thing that they're kind of looking at and you never see her. But a really interesting decision in terms of direction to make it that way, and I thought it was worth making that point. Moving on to 1971, we have a made-for-TV film with Susanna York and George Scott. Something I've noticed that this film does, and some of the previous films do as well, is that they kind of have to skip over some details because, you know, it's a film and, you know, we've only got a couple of hours, we've got to get all the story in. So what they do is they get rid of all the nice teachers at Jane's school, Lowood, Miss Temple, and they keep Mr. Brocklehurst there. So what happens in the book is that Mr. Brocklehurst is awful, some of the girls die of typhus, and then a board comes in and says, right, you can't run this school anymore because the girls are dying. And then Lowood becomes a nice place, Jane stays there for a few more years and then becomes a teacher there for 2 years, and she really enjoys school before she goes to Thornfield Hall. In these films, that doesn't happen. Mr. Brocklehurst is the headmaster of the school the whole time, no one comes in and interferes, and she has this very awful Dickensian childhood in the institution all the way up until the point where she leaves Thornfield. So in order for that to make sense, this film and the previous film both have a scene where Miss Brocklehurst asks her to be a teacher, and she says, no way am I staying here, you're a tyrant and I hate this school and I'm gonna leave, and she has this like moment of lashing back to Mr. Brocklehurst before she runs off to Thornfield Hall, which is kind of just an interesting way of framing it, because I think it makes a lot more sense that she's enjoyed school for a few years because she's a lot more accomplished and that's how she can teach Adele, rather than she's had this awful childhood. But then at the same time, it's interesting if she's had a really awful time at school and then when she comes to Thornfield Hall, it's just this new place and it's the best place she's ever been. Because it seems like a small point, but I think it actually changes Jane's motivations as a character, depending on whether she's had a good time or a bad time at school. But getting back to this film, it's an okay adaptation, really. Mr. Rochester is fine. It's a good performance, but for me it's not the right interpretation of the character. He's just kind of stern, and he has random outbursts of anger and violence which seem to come from nowhere, but he's not really very witty or sarcastic or funny. I struggle to see what Jane would see in him. It doesn't seem to have very much warmth about him. Also, he's really a lot older than Jane, and I know he's supposed to be older than Jane anyway, but this guy's kind of an old man. So instead of having the dynamic where you have a young woman and a man falling in love, you have Jane being a woman, like she's a lot older, and him being an old man, which just kind of gives us an odd relationship dynamic. It doesn't really lend itself for them falling in love. I just don't know why Jane would want to be with him, because he's really old and mean. And Jane is just kind of, just kind of nothingy for me. She's not fantastic, but she's not bad. It's not a bad performance, but she's not overtly passionate, and it's just okay. But I still don't really get their relationship. I just didn't believe in it, to be honest. Now we have our 1973 TV adaptation starring Saoirse Cusack. This is the first TV adaptation that we have, and therefore it's obviously a lot more thorough, goes into a lot of detail. To be honest, I feel like this adaptation takes the word literal to kind of new levels. It's literal to the point where you just think, I feel like I'm watching an audiobook. Like it just feels like the whole book. There's a lot of voiceover from Jane, so you'll see Jane having a conversation, and in between the dialogue there'll be a voiceover of her going, oh, I thought this, so I said, and then she says. Another example is the scene when Rochester is kind of cross-examining Jane and saying, oh, can you paint, can you play the piano? And he says, you can play the piano, okay, go into the hall, into the library, and leave the door open, and then play the piano in there, and then I'll listen in here. And so she goes and she takes the candle and she walks through the hall, she goes through the library, and then she plays a little bit, and then he goes, okay, that's enough, and then she comes back in, and I just think, oh, the piano could have been in the same room, couldn't it? We didn't need that 20 minutes of her walking to the piano. And I know there's an argument for being realistic and keeping in the book, but I just think that's taking it too far. There are some points where you need to have a bit of creative directing for me, and I do find incessant voiceovers very lazy, and keeping it exactly to the letter as Charlotte Bronte wrote it equally lazy. Like, I think there does need to be some interpretation happening. In terms of their relationship, again, I just didn't really believe the love. I found their conversations quite wooden and quite laboured, and I just didn't care at the end of the day whether she left or stayed. It was just nothing to me. It didn't really have that spark. However, one of the things I really liked about this film is the interpretation of Blanche Ingram. In a lot of the earlier films, Jane has been cast as someone who is very conventionally beautiful. In the book, she is supposed to be very, very plain, and Blanche is supposed to be this beautiful, accomplished woman that she could never aspire to be like. So because they've obviously cast someone beautiful as Jane to begin with, Blanche therefore becomes this really over elaborate and extravagant character with incredibly arched eyebrows, and she's very bitchy and becomes almost like a caricature of herself, and you just think, why would Mr. Rochester ever like her? In this adaptation, Blanche is very, very normal. She's very pretty, but in a very normal way. She's like a normal, pretty woman. And her interpretation of Blanche's character is just so well accomplished. What she does is, instead of making her bitchy and unlikable, she keeps her very, very charming. And when she's being bitchy and snide and selfish and just silly to other people, she does it in such a way that you almost don't realise it, and you could really well imagine some of the other young men in society falling for her and finding her very, very charming and not noticing that she's being rude to the other women, and it's just done so well. You kind of could reasonably see that Rochester could fall for her, and it was done in such a subtle way as well, which I just think was fantastic. So that was probably the one redeeming thing about this adaptation. And then the final adaptation for this video is a TV series from 1983 starring Timothy Dalton and Zilla Clark. This series is very similar to the previous one, but just a lot slicker, and it's just not as stilted as the previous TV adaptation. It is as leisurely and it does have as much detail, but for me, I feel this interpretation is a lot better. That might have something to do with the fact that it's not hour-long episodes. They're half an hour long episodes. I think there's something like 12 episodes and each of them are half an hour, which is really great because it has it's like sizable chunks of Jane Eyre, so you don't ever feel kind of overwhelmed or that it's going too slowly. Something that I personally really loved about this adaptation is that it starts with the first line of the book, which was there was no possibility of taking a walk that day, and you have a little voiceover right at the beginning, which is kind of Jane Eyre's voice, and then you have another voiceover right at the end, which is talking about what happens after her and Rochester got married. But there's no voiceover all the way through like you had in the previous one, which is just so much better. Timothy Dalton is a particularly good. I think he's got a very good mix of being angry and sarcastic and brooding, but after he and Jane have agreed to get married, you can see he has such genuine joy and he's so much love for her, and they are really happy together up until the point where they have their disastrous wedding attempt, and that's really nice to see. In a lot of the other adaptations, it just feels a bit forced or not very genuine, and you just see them delighting in each other and the fact that they've finally come together, and I think that's really very nice. Zilla Clark as Jane Eyre is a much more subtle performance, I feel, than some of the other adaptations, and she seems quite quiet, but there's definitely a spark there, and that's what I like. I think it's really hard because Jane is quite a complex character because she does come across quite meek and she's quite reserved once she's at Thornfield Hall, but when you're reading it you know that she's got all these thoughts under the surface, and I do feel like, having watched some of these versions, that it's difficult to communicate that as an actress, that she has got passion underneath, but she's being quiet, and I think it works really well in this version. This is probably, since Jane Fontaine and Orson Welles, this is my most loved pairing. I feel like the relationship is really convincing, and especially at the end when Jane comes back to Ferndean House and Miss Rochester is injured and he's blind. I found that so beautiful. It's such a passionate reunion, and those are the bits that I love in the books, the kind of passionate talks that they have. So in summary of these first few adaptations that I've watched, I feel like my favourite ones are probably either the Orson Welles adaptation 1943 and the Timothy Dalton version, TV version of 1983. I enjoyed both of those. I think both of them have very similar interpretations of Rochester, which is just generally being kind of surly or rude, but actually you can tell that there's some amusement there, and it's kind of done with intention, and he's kind of toying with Jane, but it's not altogether negative. He's not doing it out of spite. And I think some of the other Rochesters, for me, come across far too brash and far too angry. And similarly, both of the Janes, for me, have a very good way of giving Jane a bit more depth, like not just being kind of quiet and meek or being like a pushover. The more modern TV adaptation is a much more genuine adaptation of the books. If you wanted to see the book brought to life on screen, this is a really detailed, very faithful adaptation, but also for me it's got a bit more of an interpretation there. It's bringing it to life a bit. It's not just kind of placing the book on screen and go, here it is, without kind of any passion or love behind it. And the 1943 version is just very of its time. It's a very good piece of cinema, of film noir, and I appreciate it for that. It's got a slightly different plot, and it is slightly condensed because it's a film and not a TV series. In its own right, I really enjoyed that as a film as well. So do let me know below if you've seen any of these adaptations and which ones of these are your favourite. I'm sure you're all looking forward to the more modern adaptations. I know I am. I absolutely love the Michael Fassbender version. But you know, that's probably me being a little bit biased. I can't think why. But as always, look forward to hearing from you in the comments, and I'm looking forward to perhaps some more overarching discussion in the next video, being able to look back on all 9 versions rather than just these first 5. So thanks for watching this first half, and I will see you next time. Bye! Of what this is, because this is one of the best and most realistic and believable characterizations of madness or, you know, mental health issues from the 19th century that I've ever read, and it just really rings true. I think a lot of the time illness in general really